June 1944, a Soviet tank commander named Dmitry Loza pushes 100 kilometers forward in just one day during Operation Bagration. His column smashes through unprepared German rear area troops who had no warning the Red Army was coming. Exhausted crews collapse at their controls. Engines seize from overwork. German supply bases erupt in flames as their guards scatter in terror. This wasn't fortune, and it wasn't sheer manpower. This was deep battle doctrine, unleashed. A revolutionary military theory that would annihilate Army Group Center, kill or capture 350,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, and drive 600 kilometers in 5 weeks. The Soviets didn't simply overpower the Germans, they outmaneuvered them intellectually. But first, Stalin would execute the very men who invented it. Late 1920s, Moscow. A visionary Red Army officer named Mikhail Tukhachevsky grapples with the defining military puzzle of his era. How do you rupture enemy defenses and sustain the momentum? How do you convert a battlefield success into total strategic victory? His solution, deep battle doctrine, would ultimately shatter the Wehrmacht. But first, Stalin would put a bullet in him. Tukhachevsky didn't develop these ideas in isolation. Vladimir Triandafilov constructed the mathematical framework, calculating precise operational ranges and advance rates. How many kilometers daily? How many supply tonnages? How many successive troop waves were required to not merely penetrate, but to drive forward until the enemy's entire defensive architecture disintegrated? Meanwhile, Georgy Isserson concentrated on armored warfare. He orchestrated rolling waves of tanks and infantry to sustain uninterrupted offensive pressure. Armor wouldn't simply create breaches, it would plunge deep behind enemy lines, eliminating reserves and headquarters before opponents could adapt. This wasn't guesswork. It was disciplined operational theory designed to prevent the grinding attrition of the First World War. The doctrine stressed continuous deep operations, not head-on attacks, but synchronized multi-echelon strikes that would pierce enemy positions, then exploit for hundreds of kilometers into rear areas. It was sophisticated. It was visionary. It was precisely what the Red Army would desperately require. Then came the Purges. Between 1937 and 1938, Stalin's paranoia devoured the Red Army's brightest minds. Tukhachevsky faced a firing squad on June 11, 1937. He was 44 years old. Triandafilov had perished in a 1931 aircraft accident, but his protégés were imprisoned or executed. Isserson was arrested in 1941. Roughly 30,000 officers were purged. Deep battle doctrine became politically dangerous, linked to traitors and enemies of the state. The concepts were banned. Training manuals vanished from circulation. The Red Army was left doctrinally hollow precisely as the supreme test of its existence drew near. When Operation Barbarossa exploded on June 22, 1941, the results were devastating. Without deep battle's focus on coordination and operational range, Soviet defensive positions crumbled. By late 1941, the Red Army had absorbed millions of casualties. Complete armies were encircled and destroyed at Kiev and Smolensk. The Wehrmacht surged hundreds of kilometers in weeks. By December 1941, the Red Army stood battered at the gates of Moscow. Millions killed. Enormous territories surrendered. Soviet leadership confronted a stark decision: keep dying with obsolete methods, or revive the forbidden concepts of the men Stalin had murdered. Desperation would become their greatest instructor. Facing existential collapse in 1942, Soviet High Command did something extraordinary. They acknowledged their executed theorists had been correct all along. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the defender of Moscow in December 1941, and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky, now serving as Chief of the General Staff, began quietly resurrecting Tukhachevsky's prohibited concepts. They reorganized entire army groups and rewrote operational procedures, all while Wehrmacht forces still occupied Soviet territory. The theories that had condemned men to death in 1937 now became the blueprint for destroying Hitler's war machine. The transformation was methodical. Vasilevsky restructured units into fronts, massive strategic formations coordinating multiple combined arms armies across hundreds of kilometers. Starting in 1943, they deployed dedicated tank armies, purpose-designed breakthrough forces built to shatter enemy lines, and rampage deep into German rear positions. Over 57,000 T-34 tanks emerged from Soviet factories during the war. Their angled armor, up to 65 millimeters thick, and diesel power plants outperformed early German panzers while remaining affordable enough for mass production at 135,000 to 170,000 rubles per unit. But deep battle wasn't about hurling armor forward and hoping for results. The doctrine became rigorously structured by echelon. The first echelon consisted of rifle corps and divisions that would breach enemy defensive zones through concentrated artillery and combined arms assault. The second echelon brought mechanized and tank formations that would then exploit the gap, driving deep while defenders were still reeling. The reserve echelon stood ready to reinforce success or redirect toward new opportunities. This wasn't human wave tactics. It was coordinated depth, mathematical and merciless. Integration became paramount. Soviet maskirovka deception evolved into an art form. False troop movements, decoy tanks, and fabricated radio communications, all designed to fix German attention in the wrong direction. Extensive reconnaissance charted enemy positions and pinpointed vulnerabilities before the first round was fired. Artillery, aviation, and engineer units synchronized their efforts to breach the layered defensive belts Germans had learned to construct. Yet Zhukov's own memoirs reveal fierce arguments over timing, scope, and logistical hazards. Some commanders urged caution, incremental advances rather than deep thrusts without adequate reserves. The doctrine demanded calculated risk, not blind confidence. The learning process was brutal. The 1942 Reserve offensives, the Reserve meat grinder, demonstrated this savagely. Deep battle applied prematurely, without sufficient forces or preparation, produced catastrophic Soviet casualties and negligible gains. Hundreds of thousands dead. The doctrine had boundaries, and mastering it demanded blood and failure before success. But by summer 1943, the rebuilt Red Army faced its ultimate examination at a place called Kursk. July 1943. German commanders launched their largest offensive since Barbarossa, Operation Citadel. They aimed to encircle and annihilate Soviet forces in the Kursk salient, recapture strategic initiative, reverse the war's trajectory. They're about to discover that deep battle functions in defense as well. Soviet intelligence, including the Lucy spy network and partisan reconnaissance, identified German offensive plans weeks ahead. This enabled construction of defensive belts reaching 300 kilometers in depth, along with over 5,000 Soviet tanks positioned in echelon reserves. The defensive phase revealed doctrinal maturity. Rather than holding rigidly at the front, Soviet forces absorbed German attacks through successive layers. German armor exhausted itself against belt after belt, while Soviet reserves remained uncommitted, waiting and calculating. War correspondent Vasily Grossman documented the human reality. Soviet sappers crawling through minefields at midnight, hands trembling as they probed the soil inch by inch. They understood that dawn tank breakthroughs depended on their survival, the deafening artillery salvos, the psychological strain of waiting in reserve while the forward lines absorbed punishment. German casualties reached 50,000 to 60,000. They lost 300 to 400 tanks. Intensity, medium. The Wehrmacht failed to achieve breakthrough. Then the Red Army unleashed devastating counter-offensives. Operations Kutuzov and Polkovodets Rumyantsev liberated Orel on August 5th, Belgorod on August 5th, and Kharkov on August 23rd. The Katyusha rocket launcher, first deployed in July 1941 at Orsha, where it obliterated a German supply depot and shocked enemy troops, reached its full potential at Kursk. Over 10,000 launchers were manufactured during the war. Its area saturation and psychological impact earned it the nickname Stalin's organ. That shriek became synonymous with Soviet firepower. Soviet strategic initiative was established for the remainder of the conflict. Deep battle had validated itself in both defensive and offensive applications. The Red Army could absorb the blow, then transition seamlessly to attack. The Germans had no answer. But Kursk was merely the beginning. The doctrine that appeared brilliant on paper now required industrial capacity to sustain it across 600 kilometers of operational depth. Paper doesn't advance 600 kilometers. The Soviets constructed something the Germans never could. A logistical apparatus capable of delivering 7,000 tons of supplies daily to multiple army groups simultaneously. This was industrialized warfare perfected. During major 1944 offensives, Soviet fronts received 5,000 to 7,000 tons of supplies per day via rail. The Red Army operated over 100,000 kilometers of military railways through a dedicated service, the VOSO. Every month, they delivered 100,000 to 150,000 tons of fuel, as well as 200,000 to 300,000 tons of ammunition to the front. The Wehrmacht had nothing comparable. German logistics still depended on horses, literally millions of horses struggling through Russian mud while Soviet trains operated around the clock. But logistics meant nothing without hardware. Here, Soviet industry demonstrated terrifying efficiency. Over 57,000 T-34 tanks emerged from production lines during the war. Each cost 135,000 to 170,000 rubles. Their sloped armor and diesel engines outmatched early German tanks and proved reliable enough that centralized repair depots could return 2,000 to 3,500 tanks to operational status monthly through repairs and rebuilding, not new production, but sustained combat strength. Add 10,000 Katyusha rocket launchers for devastating area saturation. Add 36,000 IL-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, the most produced military aircraft of World War II, providing devastating close air support that suppressed German infantry, armor and artillery during breakthrough and exploitation phases. The Germans obsessed over these production figures, but they missed the essential point. This wasn't merely about building tanks. It was about sustaining multi-echelon operations across hundreds of kilometers. Deep battle doctrine required second and third echelon forces to find fuel, ammunition, and replacements waiting when they arrived. The Red Army maintained replacement pools of 250,000 to 400,000 men at any given time during 1944 and 45. They dispatched 1.5 million replacements to the front in 1944 alone. When a tank army broke through, it didn't halt because ammunition ran out or fuel tanks emptied. It kept advancing. Sustained by a logistical system the Wehrmacht couldn't match and couldn't neutralize. With doctrine refined and logistics established, the Red Army was prepared to demonstrate what deep battle could achieve at full scale. The target was Army Group Center. The operation was Bagration. The result would be one of the most catastrophic military defeats in recorded history. June 23, 1944. German commanders in Army Group Center remain confident the primary Soviet summer offensive will strike further south. They are catastrophically mistaken. Within 24 hours, Soviet artillery tears gaps in their lines. Within a week, German units are retreating eastward faster than they had advanced in 1941. Within 2 months, Army Group Center ceases to exist. Operation Bagration wasn't improvisation. It was deep battle doctrine executed with mathematical precision. The mature expression of everything Tukhachevsky had envisioned 2 decades earlier. For weeks before the offensive, Soviet reconnaissance teams mapped every German strongpoint, minefield, and reserve position. Meanwhile, maskirovka deception operations, false troop movements, dummy tanks, and carefully orchestrated radio traffic convinced German intelligence the main assault would fall on Ukraine, hundreds of kilometers to the south. When the storm finally erupted on June 23rd across Belarusia, the Germans were looking the wrong direction. The Soviet force was immense, over 2.3 million troops, 5,200 tanks, and 5,300 aircraft across 4 coordinated fronts: 1st Baltic, 3rd Belarusian, 2nd Belarusian, and 1st Belarusian. But this wasn't about overwhelming numbers. It was about operational sophistication. The offensive unfolded exactly as Doctrine prescribed. Massed artillery pulverized German defensive belts. 1st Echelon rifle divisions smashed through the shattered positions. Then came the tank armies, those dedicated exploitation forces created in 1943, pouring through the breaches and racing deep into German rear areas. This was operational art, not brute force. It was synchronized, echeloned, and devastating. Tank commander Dmitry Loza later described his unit's advance during Bagration, 100 kilometers covered in a single day. Crews so exhausted they fell asleep at their stations during brief halts. Tanks breaking down from the relentless tempo. The surreal experience of overrunning German supply depots and headquarters, whose occupants had no idea Soviet armor was anywhere near them. The exploitation phase moved faster than German commanders could comprehend what was happening. The numbers tell the story of annihilation. Soviet casualties reached 765,000 total, including 178,000 killed or missing and 587,000 wounded. Substantial losses, but sustainable given the strategic outcome. German casualties hit 350,000 to 400,000 killed, wounded, or missing, with Army Group Center effectively ceasing to exist as a fighting force. In just over 2 months, the Red Army advanced more than 600 kilometers. They liberated Belarusia, eastern Poland, and the Baltic states. Minsk fell July 3rd. Vilnius fell July 13th. By August, Soviet forces reached the Vistula River. The German Central Front collapsed entirely. Soviet strategic dominance was secured for the remainder of the war. Bagration wasn't an anomaly. It was deep battle doctrine executed with precision, the culmination of years of learning, restructuring, and industrial mobilization. But what did this sophistication look like for the men inside the tanks? The engineers clearing minefields under fire. The civilians caught in the operational depth. Behind every operational arrow on the map was a Soviet sapper crawling through a minefield at midnight. A tank crew driving until their vehicle broke down from exhaustion. A family fleeing their burning village with minutes of warning. Deep battle sophistication didn't eliminate chaos. It channeled chaos into operational art that the Germans couldn't counter. War correspondent Vasily Grossman observed Soviet sappers clearing minefields under fire at night during Kursk, their hands shaking as they probed the earth inch by inch, knowing that dawn tank breakthroughs depended on their survival. Tank commander Dmitry Loza described his unit advancing 100 kilometers in a single day during Bagration. The exhilaration of breakthrough followed by exhaustion so complete that crews fell asleep at their controls, vehicles breaking down from mechanical fatigue, while German rear echelon troops fled in panic. Letters from rank-and-file soldiers describe chaos, fear, and elation in equal measure during those rapid advances. Viktor Nekrasov's In the Trenches of Stalingrad captured the ground-level reality, the contrast between High Command's strategic vision and the mud, blood, and confusion of actual combat. And in Ukraine, Grossman documented families fleeing burning villages with minutes of warning, caught between retreating Germans destroying everything and advancing Soviets reshaping the landscape through operational depth. This is where we confront the persistent myth directly. Soviet success wasn't about human wave attacks or mindless numerical superiority. Detailed operational records from 1943 onward demonstrate meticulous planning, combined arms sophistication, and operational surprise, not frontal assaults. Yes, early war Soviet attacks were costly and disorganized. The 1942 Rzhev offensives demonstrated this brutally. Deep battle applied prematurely produced catastrophic casualties and minimal gains. But from 1943 to 1945, late war offensives minimized unnecessary losses through concentrated firepower, extensive intelligence gathering, and maneuver warfare that the Wehrmacht simply couldn't match. Even German commanders acknowledged this in their after-action reports, expressing shock at Soviet operational sophistication, the effectiveness of Maskirovka, and the collapse of German fronts under multi-echelon assaults. Deep battle worked because it was doctrine, not desperation. The doctrine that Tukhachevsky conceived in the 1920s, that Stalin nearly destroyed in the 1930s, and that Zhukov perfected in the 1940s, didn't die with the Wehrmacht. Deep battle remains foundational in Russian military thought and is studied worldwide. The US Army's air-land battle doctrine of the 1980s drew directly on these lessons: operational depth, multi-domain integration, and striking enemy reserves before they could react. Modern Russian new generation warfare continues adapting these concepts, incorporating cyber, information, and hybrid elements. The operational art that destroyed Army Group Center still shapes how 21st century militaries think about breakthrough, exploitation, and the brutal mathematics of modern war. From the mathematical brilliance of Tukhachevsky's theories to the smoking ruins of Army Group Center, deep battle proved that victory belongs not to the largest army, but to the most sophisticated doctrine executed with precision. The Red Army that stumbled into 1941 with millions of casualties learned to coordinate multi-echelon offensives across 600 kilometers. They synchronized 36,000 aircraft with 57,000 tanks. They delivered 7,000 tons of supplies daily to the front. They transformed operational art into operational annihilation. This wasn't the human wave myth. This was the brutal mathematics of modern warfare, perfected. Deep battle won World War II, and it's still winning wars today. If you enjoyed this story, hit subscribe for more World War II historical deep dives every week. Thanks for watching.